Hi, everyone, and welcome to this latest UK in a Changing Europe lunch hour. I almost said podcast then. I'm losing it. I'm delighted that today we've got together our regular panel of economic experts to reflect on what we heard yesterday from Rachel Reeves in the spring statement. They don't need any introduction, but very quickly, Sarah Hall, University of Cambridge, Jill Rutter, IFG and UK in a Changing Europe, Jonathan Portes from King's and UK and Changing Europe, and Ben Chew from the BBC. As ever, I'm just going to kick you all off with a very softball starter for 10, which is what are your sort of headline thoughts on what Rachel Reeves said yesterday? And I've been told that I have to pick on people now rather than leaving these pregnant pauses. So, Jill, you go first.
Okay, I thought you definitely go to Ben, so that was bad move. Headline thoughts. I actually thought watching it that Rachel Reeves was remarkably bullish actually in her presentation. I mean, it came over as sort of, I thought surprisingly sort of confident and assertive, but as I think others are going to go on to say, uh, having sworn she only wanted one fiscal event a year, and having acknowledged that it was sort of very difficult times, I think, and quite predictably difficult times, even back in October when she had her budget, she left herself so much boxed in by her combination of fiscal rules and minimal headroom that she had to act, and actually did mainly, predominantly on the spending side, given she'd ruled out tax changes and whatever. We did get the conventional crackdown on tax avoidance, but I was quite heartened to read a thread by Dan Nidal where he said he actually thought there's some really big substantive changes to the way in which we approached particularly the marketing of tax avoidance scheme and the role of lawyers in that, and gave HMRC some real new powers. So maybe that will genuinely materialise. But it was a sort of slightly frustrating, and it's sort of really, really interesting. The most striking thing is that Rachel Reeves so desperately reconstructed that headroom to one, some people say two, I was corrected on that this morning, one or two decimal places, really, really things. And I remember when I was at the Treasury, and the Treasury did the forecasting back then, and the PSBR forecast were always a long way out. Everybody said it's incredibly difficult. Basically, what you're forecasting is a very small difference between two incredibly large numbers. And the Chancellor seems to be trying to sort of micromanage down to really implausibly accurate numbers. And you slightly feel that all the conversation between now and the autumn, when we get the real budget, is going to be how are those numbers changing again?
And I mean, we'll come back onto this, but that's all the sillier, I think, in a time of such global turbulence that you're sort of worrying about such small numbers in a time when things can change so quickly. But anyway, Ben, I'll take Jill's advice and go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Jill was saying, really, my big takeaway from yesterday was that this is the kind of thing that happens if a chancellor leaves themselves with tiny slither of headroom, less than a third of 1% of GDP, and you've got no tolerance for being forecast to miss your target 5 years out. I mean, that is just nothing. It can be, as we've seen, entirely wiped out by not even that significant changes in the bond market, not even that significant changes in GDP forecasts. So this is what you get, and you get this, to be honest, quite undignified scramble to find those savings to be seen to be on track to hit your fiscal rules 5 years out. So there's a lot of complaints in the run up to this saying that the OBR's forecasts are setting government policy, but it's not really. It's the government which has created this situation by leaving itself with so little headroom. Now, yes, it's true that it looks like the tail is wagging the dog. The tail of the forecasts is wagging the dog of policy. But to slightly mix metaphors, it's the dog that's chosen to have a very short and waggable tail here. And that's what's driving what we've seen from the government. So I think it's important to get that in perspective. I think the other big takeaway for me, was of risks crystallizing, if you like. You're talking about, the risks that the OBR has flagged many, many times, that if productivity doesn't pick up, or if there's impacts on trade, or if there's all these other things which could upset their forecast, they're kind of happening. And, I think the nod to the tariff trade war was very appropriate in terms of the impact of that on the overall economy and on the public finances, because we'll see what happens next week. But if our lack of exception from the steel and aluminium tariffs is anything to go by, we won't be exempted either from the car tariffs that Trump is putting in. We'll see. But I think that's a good sense of what these risks are actually coming home to roost, and we should read the scenarios in the OBR's forecasts as closely as we do the main forecast.
I suppose the other key takeaway is you've got to be very, very careful about the analogies you use, otherwise you'll get criticised for them. But I mean, just on that, it's even worse than you said, isn't it? Because it's not about hitting your targets 5 years out. It's about OBR projections of what might be happening 5 years out, giving the impression you will be hitting your target. And everyone knows, I mean, particularly in this current atmosphere, that, I mean, it's always the case that you should take forecasts with a pinch of salt, but you should take them with a slightly larger pinch now, shouldn't you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think Charlie Bean, obviously ex-OBR, ex-Bank of England, made this point quite forcefully. I think it was an IFG event, didn't he? He's saying it's not grown up to be fine-tuning policy in this way. And I think that probably, I suspect the OBR itself would agree with that if it was allowed to have an opinion on this.
Yeah. Let's try and avoid mentioning the IFG, particularly given Jill's awful background there. But Sarah, over to you.
Given it was a Resolution Foundation event, but anyway.
Let's name all the competitors. Sarah.
Yeah, no such backgrounds here, I'm afraid. Yeah, what struck me, and actually building on Ben's, was the section in the OBR report around key risks in the economic forecast. They make pretty grim reading to me, because normally when you think about risks in forward-looking work, it's things that might happen or could happen, or even if you're lucky, really serious things that possibly won't happen. But actually, there's quite a lot of those risks seem to be increasingly being baked in. So Ben's already mentioned the risks around the global outlook, and obviously, almost immediately after Rachel Reeves' statement, we get updates on car tariffs. So, that's a really immediate sign of this kind of very challenging, more protectionist, less open world economy. I think the other risk that stood out for me was risks around productivity growth. And if, at the moment, the OBR is working on trend productivity averaging 1% a year, but notes that, if the sort of current averages of around 0.3% persist, that's going to cause challenges to the forecast. And a lot of the work that's been done on productivity would suggest to me that at the moment it's going to be quite hard to deliver kind of productivity increases at around that 1%. So I think, the sort of limited headroom is a problem in and of itself, but it's particularly a problem when there's risks that are outside, to some extent, outside of the UK and government's control. And that then made me think that actually, one of the things that commentators say could really help the UK is certainty in terms of investment, certainty in terms of policy, certainty in terms of taxes. And in some ways, this statement feels a little bit like the first course of sort of 2 or 3 subsequent events this year, which are going to be important. One around the summer spending round, which looks like it's going to be very challenging. And then obviously, the possibility, and some would argue the growing possibility, that Rachel Reeves is going to need to look for further cuts and or tax changes in the autumn budget. So to some extent, it feels like the first course of a kind of 3-course meal that still presents a quite significant uncertainty in the UK economy.
Yeah, I always thought it was a bit of a hostage to fortune. It was at the CBI, wasn't it, when she said, I won't be coming back with more borrowing or more tax rises, which seemed a slightly rash thing to say. But Jonathan.
So just to add to what others have said, I mean, I blame Tony Benn. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't have to do this. Yesterday wouldn't have happened anyway. And frankly, it should not have happened at all. And that's really what Charlie Bean said, which is, look, the Chancellor very sensibly said in October, I only want to have one fiscal event a year in October where we make tax and spending changes. And that makes a good deal of sense. It certainly makes sense in current circumstances, because actually relatively little has happened, in my view, to the UK economy since October. The minor changes to the forecast are really actually small change in the grand scheme of things. What has changed is the risks going forward, which we've all just discussed. But because but the changes to what's happened and even to the central forecast aren't really that earth-shattering. They only change the numbers by a bit. Of course, given the very small amount of margin for error she had in her rule, that meant she had to come forward with a fiscal event, even though she said she wasn't going to have it. And that's really just stupid. They should just have changed the rules, not the fiscal rules, but said, right, the OBR is going to have a four. And this is actually what Charlie Beam said. The government could perfectly well have said, okay, the OBR has changed its forecast a bit. We'll come back in October and give you another fiscal event. And we will meet the rules at that time, but we're not really going to worry about this because, frankly, it hasn't changed the big outlook. And I think that's particularly the case given the big things that are coming up in the next few months. We have a spending review, we have an industrial strategy, we have an immigration white paper, we have a child poverty review. All these are really big deals for the economic and social future of this country, right? And we should really be focusing on what they say, what they're going to deliver. And then, as a consequence of that, and of Trump and of all the things that are happening externally, you may very well need to make tax and spending changes at the budget. And my view would be you probably are going to need to raise taxes. But let's wait till the budget and do that in a sensible way. Given that, what do I think about yesterday? I'm sort of inclined to sort of shrug my shoulders and say, well, it is unfortunate, I think, that they did what, as others have said, faffed around with spreadsheets, the result of which is a, frankly, not very coherent package of measures on disability and incapacity benefits, part of which is excellent, sensible, back to work support, and part of which is just cuts to make the numbers add up. Now, I think you can make a case for restraining spending on personal independence payment, but that's not the same as saying, well, let's find 5 billion worth of cuts willy-nilly to make the numbers add up. And I think that's a mistake. But beyond that, there's really very little in this in macroeconomic terms, right? So they are doing their best to stand pat, and frankly, I think that's actually quite a sensible thing to do. And to wait till October. At that point, I think they're, depending on what risks do materialize, we may very well need some more significant changes. I would like to see a proper package of both tax reform and some tax increases, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, I've got a question about the labour market. I want to put to you in a sec, but Jill, were you waving? Jill, are you going to say something about the 1975 Industry Act?
Well, I was indeed going to talk about the 1975 Industry Act. Because I think, that's the act that obliges the UK to publish 2 forecasts a year. And the problem is the second forecast has grown over time into a sort of significant fiscal event rather than just a sort of, that's interesting, temperature check on where the economy is. So if chancellors do feel obliged then to react, the obvious answer is to repeal that requirement and just have 1 forecast a year, do that. And the real shame of Rachel Reeves is that she missed the opportunity to do that when she was committing to 1 fiscal event in the year, because one of the things she did introduce very early on was what she calls her fiscal lock legislation, which basically, to avoid another Liz Truss big fiscal event, no forecast, was to hand to the OBR the power to say that actually some fiscal changes were significant enough that they would produce a forecast. So if a chancellor did decide to do some big package, the OBR could then say, well, actually, that's change things. We need to do another assessment of that. And I think that would have been absolutely the right occasion for her to say, now we've given the OBR that power, we are going to get off this hamster treadmill of having 2 forecasts a year. We will have, the significant forecast then. And then if there are big changes during the year, because chancellors are obliged to act, then they'll be accompanied by an OBR forecast if they think it's necessary.
Okay, Jonathan, just a question on the labour market we've had in, which says, oh, there are only 709,000 vacancies according to the ONS and over 1.5 million registered unemployed. So how does the government find jobs for those they're taking off benefits? Does it add up?
I think, frankly, I would not pay much attention to the vacancy numbers. They're a sort of overall indicator, perhaps, of the level, vaguely, of the level of labour demand at any one point, or at least they're correlated with it. But you can't simply match the unemployed with the vacancies. It depends where the vacancies are, who there are. And in fact, we have discovered in the UK labour market that generating supply does indeed generate its own demand in the labour market. If you can, and so I'm quite optimistic in this, in the sense that if you can get people, if people want to work and they are able to work, yeah, that is to say they're motivated to work, and in the case of people with health or disability conditions, that they have the right support or accommodation that they need in order to be able to work, then the jobs will, in fact, be there for them. That doesn't mean it's easy. In fact, it's more difficult to generate jobs by increasing labour supply than it is simply by pumping up demand. But if we can get the back to work support right, then I think we will. Then people will indeed get jobs. And remember that flows in the labour market are far larger than you think if you just look at the level of vacancies, right? Every year, 5 or 6 million people get a new job. 5 or 6 million people move out of work, either because they change jobs or because they become unemployed or because they retire. There's a huge amount of dynamism in the UK labour market.
Okay, and Ben, you touched on this earlier, but let's just get this out of the way now. I mean, there's been quite a lot of criticism of the OBR, people saying it's far too powerful. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's as I described, really. The OBR is simply doing what ministers have asked it to do, which is to evaluate the prospects for the economy and the public finances, and then judge what they think will happen to the public finances against the government's chosen fiscal rules on the basis of that. So they're not doing anything that they haven't done since they were established, really. What we've got into this situation because, as I said before, the government has given itself very little headroom, a third of 1% of GDP, and a 5-year ahead forecast, a very small shift in either direction, based on different assumptions or even just revisions to past data, can actually wipe out that headroom incredibly easily. So the issue is not the fact that the OBR is doing what ministers have asked it to do. It's the fact that the government has chosen certain parameters for its public finances and its spending and tax plans. So I think it's really, really important to get that straight. Now, obviously, you can say that we shouldn't have an OBR at all, and that's, you can have that argument. But given that the OBR is simply doing what ministers have asked it to do, it seems slightly unreasonable to criticise it for that, it seems to me.
Jill, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ministers that make the OBR extremely powerful. I mean, yeah, the biggest accretion of power by the OBR was a consequence of Liz Truss deciding to go ahead with a mini budget and dispensing with an OBR assessment, which has basically meant subsequent chancellors really can't do that because of the market reaction there. But it's always open to ministers to say, as I think sort of Rachel Reeves, done, we don't think the OBR is taking full account of some of these changes we're making. We think this will happen, or point to things that are coming down the line that OBR haven't taken into account. I mean, there is a really interesting change in this, which Ben or Jonathan might want to comment a bit more on, which is that ministers do seem to have persuaded, strong-armed, I'm not sure, the OBR into scoring a growth uplift from increased house building by the end of the forecast period. So we've got that adding 0.2 to GDP in the last year, and prospectively adding 0.4% to GDP, which, given the sort of lackluster numbers we're talking about, is quite a big hike from the government's planning reforms to date. And that's something the OBR has always refused to do in the past. So I do think the OBR has become a bit mythical. There was a very interesting thing in the OBR press conference yesterday, where a journalist said to Richard Hughes, haven't you become too powerful, sort of overmighty? He said, we've got the same powers we've always had. It's just how ministers choose to react to the way in which to what we do and treat it. And, as Ben has said, they're really giving the OBR loads of powers by saying our fiscal rules are ironclad and then giving themselves hugely little room for manoeuvre against them, which means that it does look as though OBR have them in a bit of an arm lock. But I'd be very interested in whether Jonathan or Ben think that the OBR was right to allow ministers to be scoring that house building increase in the way they have.
Well, I do think it's very interesting, and on the whole, I think it's positive. I mean, I don't think we don't know exactly what was said, but the OBR are genuinely pretty independent, and I don't think they would have scored it if they weren't reasonably persuaded that the evidence was fairly strong. It's worth it's worth noting, actually. I mean, the OBR, this is the first time that they've scored a sort of quote supply side measure as a positive impact to growth. But of course, it's not the first time they've scored a supply side measure as having an impact on growth, because they put in a whacking great impact to growth from Brexit, which of course was not about macro or public spending in the main. It was about what happens if you put lots of tariffs and trade barriers on your exports and imports. And they did that based on their review of the academic literature and discussions with people in government on what the government's own modelling said about Brexit. So in that sense, it's not unprecedented for them to say, well, we'll look at the academic literature, we'll talk to people in government about what precisely is going to happen, make a best guess. It will be wrong, of course. Things will either be better or worse than we expect. But nonetheless, the central estimate here is not zero, so our central estimate should not be zero. So I think that's perfectly reasonable. I do also think that the macro, the sort of on the overall macro stance, that perhaps there's a bit of an exaggeration of their power here. Remember, the government's fiscal rule, the one that's binding, is that they should broadly balance current revenues and current taxes. First of all, this is not the event, as others have said, this is Rachel Reeves's rule, it's not the OBR's, but it's also a rule that has been around in both the academic literature and, frankly, in sort of common sense, borrow to invest, for as long as anyone can possibly remember, right? This is not a new concept. And it's likely to be binding in a way which it wasn't, say, in the early 2010s, when we were in a period of secular stagnation, interest rates at their zero lower bound, markets queuing up to lend money to governments because they were the safe asset and so on. And there, all the basic Keynesian intuitions told you didn't need to worry about that rule, and in fact you shouldn't worry about that rule, and the markets would not punish you if you didn't worry about this rule. We are now in a position where long-term interest rates are nowhere near the zero lower bound. Short-term interest rates are nowhere near the lower bound. We are not in an era of secular stagnation anymore. In terms of the macro picture, you would expect that rule to be broadly binding. It's not the OBR which invented that rule. It's not even Rachel Reeves that invented the rule. There are genuinely macroeconomic disciplines on what the government can do in terms of tax and spending.
Just one final thing on the OBR, and I suppose this is for the two of you who've worked in government and know how these things work. What happens in practice? I mean, how detailed are these conversations? Do people dangle peerages in front of Richard Hughes if he scores things right? I mean, just how much of a conversation goes on, or how much of a firewall is there?
Oh, I think a big lot of conversation goes on, but I don't think it's about dangling peerages. I think it's Anna Valero and John Van Reenen in the Treasury saying, look, here's a literature review of the estimated impact of planning restrictions on growth in 24 OECD countries over the period 1990 to 2015. And the elasticity of this against that is 0.035. That's the sort of thing that happens.
And we saw that before when they allowed an uplift from the childcare expansion as adding to labour supply, and that would also have a positive uplift. I mean, more generally, what's interesting about the OBR, when quite a few people say, well, why don't you just, the OBR's not that great about forecasting. I think Hughes would say they're as good as other forecasters. But the OBR gets access to, so two things. So there's one, the macro forecast. The other bit is the fiscal forecast and the OBR costing of individual interventions and measures, making behavioural assumptions, things. And there, the government will go with their sort of, we're doing this, we think it will do that. And that's then triggers a conversation with the OBR about the plausibility of those assumptions and what to do. And we saw that it was very clear from the irritation that we had from Richard Hughes a bit yesterday, that the government welfare package came through extremely late, and the OBR really thought it should have had longer to have a look at what all the effects were. And there was those stories that very much at last minute the Treasury had to find another saving to make their ludicrously precise number back to the number they first thought of. Absolutely, literally, because the OBR costed the welfare reforms they announced last week at yielding slightly less than the Treasury had estimated going in. So there's a sort of big discussion that goes in. The quality of the discussion on tax and on what we call annually managed expenditure, so the forecast bits of expenditure like welfare, is very, very different. This is one of the big issues we saw revealed by that the exchange around the time of the budget. It's very different to the assumptions that the OBR make on the cash limited spending, on DEL spending, where they may forecast a bit of an underspend or not on current spending, but they basically just assume the government can deliver the numbers that they have. And you'll remember that argument that was part of Rachel Reeves's black hole was that the OBR was misled about some of the numbers by the Treasury to put into that forecast last March at Jeremy Hunt's spring budget.
And just on the welfare reform specifically, is it your sense, any of you really, that, I mean, Darren Jones was right on the substance, if not in his choice of analogy, to say that actually these costs are misleading because they're not assuming, our assumption is that these people get into work and that has a positive impact. Is that convincing?
I mean, I think it's true in the sense that the OBR hasn't, made any assumptions or come to any view on what the labour supply impact will be. I mean, I would note that, yes, you would expect some positive impact, but unless the programs are significantly more successful than they are in the past, it's unlikely to be that huge. And the OBR is not, obviously the government will say our programs are going to be much more successful than previous ones, but I think that is unlikely to persuade the OBR. Remember that the OBR did score an impact on employment from the employer's national insurance contributions rise in October. It scored a negative employment impact of about 50,000 jobs for a £20 billion or whatever it was tax increase, right? So the OBR did say, yes, it will cost jobs. Actually, the number of jobs it's cost is 50,000 out of the 1 million jobs that the OBR expects to be created over the next 4 years. So not entirely negligible around the edges, but not really huge numbers. And I would expect that to be the case for employment support measures as well.
Thank you. Ben, I just want to come back very, very quickly to something you've mentioned a couple of times, which is headroom, which is partly just to get you to explain what it is, what it means.
Yes.
Secondly, just to basically sort of spell out a little bit more explicitly your argument about how much is right. I mean, there's a very interesting chart in the FT about relative levels of headroom chancellors leave themselves, but why it matters.
Yeah. Well, it's one that we sort of struggle with actually a bit at the BBC, because we're often said, well, what does headroom, as you've just asked, what does it mean? And a lot of people assume it's like a sort of a pot of money or a reserve, which it very clearly isn't. I mean, in short, it's the difference between, as Jonathan was saying, the element of headroom that bites now is current budget balance. So it's the difference between tax revenues and spending 5 years out, and this is for day-to-day spending, not for capital spending. So it's if you've got, given that they want to be matching those two in 5 years' time, the headroom is the leeway they have between the two numbers, essentially. And as you know, as I stressed, £10 billion might sound a lot, but in an economy which spends £1.2 trillion a year in government expenditure and raises about £1 trillion a year in tax, that's just really not a lot of money at all, and can be easily wiped out by very small changes. So yes, headroom. We've talked about it in terms of, should we call it headroom? Should we call it flexibility? Should we call it a buffer? But I think it's really hard to get it into people's heads without actually showing them visually what it is, which isn't that easy to do.
I mean, the danger, I suppose, is that people immediately think about the sort of maxing out the credit card analogy and things like that, and it's not that. It's very different to that.
Yeah, and it should be said also, it's a headroom against a chosen fiscal rule rather than any sort of economic law or something that's a hard real life economic constraint. They've chosen these rules, and it's the headroom against hitting that.
Sarah, just
I was just going to come in on that actually, because I think it's like discussion points to one of the big challenges facing Reeves is that I don't think the electorate vote on whether what the UK's headroom is, or they don't vote on particularly, what the OBR says about, what might happen in the UK economy in a few months' time. But I think there are some very near-term changes that are not going to be good news, particularly for UK households. So things like, what are households going to experience in the coming weeks? A significant increase in council tax bills in a lot of areas, the sort of working through of some of the NIC changes that were previously announced. So I think there's quite a big disjuncture here between Whitehall getting very animated about, how Rachel Reeves is managing or not managing her very limited headroom, and the kind of lived experience of the UK economy for households and particularly for small businesses and the kind of challenges that they face. And I think that is a real challenge when the sort of guiding star of the government is delivering growth, but that doesn't kind of come through in people's kind of annual household budget.
You could add rising energy costs to that as well, to the mix. But when you made your earlier intervention, you were talking about productivity growth. And, everyone here knows that one of the big issues that has haunted our economy, since 2008, if not before, is sort of pretty low levels of productivity growth. Is there anything happening that might lead you to think that government's trying to get a handle on this? I mean, these sort of big long-term problems that have dogged us.
I mean, Jonathan mentioned some of the bigger kind of policy reviews, if you like, coming through from the government. And I think there are two that are really relevant here. One is around the industrial strategy and the extent to which that addresses productivity. And the other is the kind of accompanying piece to that on trade, which we're expecting in the spring, summer period. I think a lot of the problem for UK productivity is around investment and delivering investment to improve productivity. And that's something that's been challenging, appears to be becoming increasingly challenging. And I think that, for me, is the kind of thorny issue. I think the other side of that that's quite interesting is that the kind of different experiences of services and manufacturing in the UK economy. So the services are really important to the UK. And until quite recently, kind of productivity in services in the UK was pretty good. Some of the more recent data suggests that productivity even in services is actually flatlining a little bit, which is a bit problematic. And I think in manufacturing, I mean, there are areas where, the UK could choose to try and really kind of develop what economists would term comparative advantage, or sort of strengths that really reflect the UK, and try and drive some productivity changes through that. So some of the opportunities around net zero, for example, that Jill might want to speak to, the kind of how you might want to harness the increased spending on security, resilience and defence, and whether you can use some of that to deliver growth, I think would be kind of areas of interest. I think the other area is, when we look at the UK's kind of productivity problem, if you want to call it that, I think the academic literature is quite clear that a lot of the problem is the kind of comparative underperformance of UK what would be termed second-tier cities, so places like Birmingham, Manchester to Leeds. So I think addressing the productivity challenges in those cities is pretty critical. And I was quite struck when Rachel Reeves earlier this year was talking about her kind of growth plans around the Oxford-Cambridge arc, the expansion of London airports. That actually doesn't do very much for those big cities that I think you need to kind of really focus on if you want to address UK productivity. And interestingly, just looping back to your early discussion on how the OBR looked at the kind of house building, in the academic literature that it's citing, it's making the point that house building could help growth through creating agglomeration in large cities, which would drive up productivity. So the OBR is viewing those cities as kind of key opportunities.
And can we just state for the record very clearly now that giving loads of public money to Manchester United to build a new stadium is not a solution to any of our problems? Good, got that off my chest. Jill, you wanted to talk, I think, earlier about there was some interesting numbers from the OBR about house building and its impact. What are your reflections on those?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, Jonathan and Ben have clearly been, thinking it's sort of, quite sensible for the OBR to score them. The OBR itself acknowledges there are quite a lot of risks around delivering those house building numbers. And what they've looked at is the changes the government's made in the NPPF and the changes potentially coming through in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which had second reading in Parliament earlier this week. But there are some really sort of critical crunch points. I mean, we know that there's a lack of capacity in planning departments in local government. The government wants to move planning to more strategic levels and things like that, wants to cut local councils out. I mean, I think the OBR is sort of assuming more or less that the government will get its planning bill through intact. That's not always been an assumption we can make about earlier governments, but if you've got that size majority, you might as well use it to reform planning. But I do think there is potentially, this goes a bit into some things Jonathan was saying about migration, there is a bit of a potential skills crunch down the line. We saw an announcement earlier in the week from Rachel Reeves about, in boosting skills and bringing more apprentices into the construction industries. But I do think there's quite a lot of risk. It's very interesting because the government going in wanted to raise house building instantly to 300 a year and deliver 1.5 million over the Parliament. Now the OBR is saying the government will fall short of that 1.5 million number, but rather more plausibly that will build up over time. The really interesting thing on construction is, can you stop the sort of stop-start that we see in construction all the time, which really characterises that when there's a dip in demand, basically the construction industry builds fewer houses, doesn't want to cannibalise its own margins, and does that largely by dispensing with what's largely a subcontractor workforce. And then you have shrinkage of skills in the sector over time. So I don't think you can take that as absolutely sort of baked in. It may be less baked in than, are there going to be tariffs? Oh yes, there were 6 hours after the Chancellor sat down that Trump announced tariffs, so they're still a week away, so who knows. But I do think there are quite a lot of risks around that assumption on house building that will be delivered within that period, because it is, it's suggesting quite a different trajectory for the industry than one we've seen before.
So just to be clear, when you're talking about cannibalising profits, you're talking about the tendency of developers to hang on to land when prices are low.
You don't put houses on the market when you think you're going to get less for them. You sort of wait, you don't flood housing or whatever. I mean, it's one of the sort of ways in which housing doesn't act like a normal market in this country.
Can I just come in on housing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was hearing Richard Hughes this morning say that his conversations with house builders has led him to led the OBR to think that maybe they can get up the rate of house building, because that's not what I've been hearing from the people in the industry I've been speaking to, and obviously a lot of analysts as well. So that's interesting. But I think I think what they've probably done is looked at what Labour has been prepared to do in terms of the planning and actually starting legislation about it, and they've taken some comfort from that Labour is serious about this. And you can argue about whether that's reasonable or not, but I think that's what's happened here, and what's made the OBR score this and assume this large uptick when it might have not have done in the past. I think in terms of my conversations with people in the industry and analysts in the housing sector is that you've really got to have the social housing piece in this. At a moment when interest rates are still very high and price to income ratios are still very stretched, it's just very, very difficult for people to afford houses, new houses and existing houses, and that there's so much spare capacity in the sector that what you really need is the government to put in a bigger grant for local housing associations to really start get the numbers up. And I think just linking this back to the big macroeconomic calls that this government has made since it's been in office, which has really been A, to at least in the short term, to try and properly fund public services, but B, as Sarah was saying, invest more, get investment rates up, and they've obviously carved that away in their fiscal rules, so they can spend more on that. So I think that's an interesting one to watch. If the government does take that advice and puts more money in the spending review into capital grants for local housing associations, I think that may make a big difference in this area. And it's certainly something which a lot of experts think is the only way they're really going to get near to those really ambitious new home building targets.
And we've only seen sustained high levels of house building in this country, which basically stopped in the sort of mid-1970s when there was very substantial building in the municipal sector. Then it was council housing. Now we'd be looking to housing association. That acts a bit sort of counter-cyclically, that there's somewhere for the industry to go when the private sector recedes. If you do that and you can maintain the sort of capacity there in smaller house builders and things like that. So I think it's really interesting to see if the government does shift the housing market quite radically, because the OBR is suggesting that that's I think part of the other gain in house building comes from freeing up greenfield land, which is builders always want to build on greenfield because it's much cheaper than building on brownfield, where you have to do a lot of remediation.
Okay. One of the other big sort of themes to emerge was the theme of sort of tightening departmental budgets for unprotected departments, and some of the numbers looking forward are quite scary. So I thought we should just play everyone's favourite game and start with Jonathan. Is this austerity, Jonathan?
I think broadly, no. If you look at the shape of spending on, current spending, what they call RDEL, and compare it with what happened in the 2010s, where you saw really quite a sharp fall, and here you see a significant rise in the first year or two, as Jill said, and then a sort of flattening and a slight rise. It's nothing like austerity then, but there are two big caveats there, obviously. The first is that the starting position is just so much worse. The 2010 government inherited public services that were working pretty well. And over the next 14 years, it trashed them and left this government with public services that clearly were not and are not working nearly as well as the public wants. So that's the big, and then the second point, of course, is the share between the unprotected departments and protected ones, in particular the NHS. And so you can see what the strategy looks like for the NHS. It's to give them significant amounts of money in the early years, and to invest that money. And by invest, I don't just mean capital investment, but invest it in improving systems, improving management, changing processes, and so on, in a way that they hope will generate significant productivity gains, beginnings at the point at which the money stops increasing so fast. So that, at least, is, in my view, a coherent strategy. It makes sense. Delivering it, of course, is extremely hard, but you can see what they want to do and why, and that they have got a spending plan that's consistent with it. It's less obvious in things like criminal justice, social care, and so on. And I think the real challenge for them, and that's why I think, what we see from the spending review is quite important, is can they actually come up with coherent plans in those areas as well that deliver restore decent quality public services in those areas without huge amounts of money, So that you don't see really massive cuts, but you do see some really sticky patches ahead, I think.
And it's probably worth reiterating what you said earlier here, which is the broader macroeconomic context then was very different to now. Interest rates
I mean,
aren't zero now.
In macroeconomic terms, this clearly is not austerity, because this is absolutely basic Keynes. The basic macroeconomics and the markets were screaming borrow and spend in the early 2010s, doing precisely what Keynes said they would, and markets sadly are not doing that now for again the reasons that Keynes would have said. Yes, there's fiscal policy is constrained, and it's constrained in a way it wasn't in the early 2010s.
Okay, we should turn to the sort of big external challenge now, which is the sort of global environment, and particularly President Trump. What impact would the application of the sorts of tariffs that Trump seems to be imposing on other countries have on us if they do apply to us? I mean, there's still all this talk about frantic negotiations for a trade deal that I have to say I'm quite skeptical about. But to what extent can that blow us off course? I mean, how significant is that to the overall economic picture? Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah. I think it depends on clearly what the tariffs are on, and also whether the UK retaliates or not. So there's a negative impact of tariffs when country X applies them to the UK, and then that is usually amplified if the UK then retaliates. So, for example, the figures I've seen on the automotive tariffs that were just raised in the US just yesterday was that, if they were applied by the US, it could reduce UK growth by 0.6%. That would increase to 1% if the UK retaliates. I think it's quite important, though, to think about it's not just the tariffs on the UK, it's how those tariffs affect other countries, which in turn affects the UK's prospects. So if you take the case of cars, it's true that the UK is not as exposed as some other European markets to automotive tariffs. But, for example, Germany is very significantly exposed. And there can be a kind of quite indirect pass-through whereby if, the German economy suffers in a particular way, bond markets respond in a particular way, which then feeds back in the UK economy. So I think, it depends on the sector, but you've also got to take a kind of like a multilateral approach, not just a kind of bilateral approach to thinking about what the tariffs do. I think the thing I was reflecting on yesterday in relation to the OBR statement and also Trump was that there's a sort of a certain irony in that, the UK for a time viewed Brexit as giving the UK the opportunity to take back control. And what seems to have happened, through the kind of changing geopolitical landscape is that it's actually incredibly hard now to take control of a domestic economy when the geopolitical context, you're so vulnerable to changes outwith of nation state boundaries.
And also, as important, if not more so in economic terms, isn't the tariffs, it's the pressure to increase defence spending, which is having a massive impact on sort of economic thinking, not just here, but across Europe. I mean, I think most defence specialists will say 2.5% is simply not enough if we're to take Europeans at their word about doing more of their security for themselves. And then, of course, savings are going to have to be found. Does anyone else want to come in on the tariff question?
Yeah, I'll come in, Anand. I think it probably is worth thinking of a bit like Brexit, because obviously you have these macroeconomic models. You can say if they went up, what would happen in the next few years. You can have a judgment. But, a world in which trading barriers are higher against other countries and everyone is doing it to everyone else will be a world in which, based on what's happened since the Second World War, when productivity has been boosted by globalization, and deglobalization will hold down our ability to grow our productivity in the long term. And that will have an impact on the economy, and that will have an impact on living standards, and that will have an impact on the public finances. So I think these sort of short-term models, which the OBR and the IMF and others have got for the impact of tariffs, don't necessarily fully capture how damaging it is in the long term. And I think it's very important to bear in mind that big picture about how globalization boosts productivity, has boosted it.
It's fascinating actually watching the case of Canada, where they're reacting to the sort of trade war with the US by reducing internal barriers to trade, which would be a really interesting one to follow. Sorry, Jill, you're going to come in.
I mean, I think it is very interesting. Mark Carney's made one of his big pictures, completing the Canadian internal market, if you like. I think it's really, really interesting. Maybe the Scots and other people who hate the Internal Market Act could note here, but I think it's really, really interesting. Obviously, works different in a genuinely federal system. But I think one of the things is that, there's tariff policy where tariff policy is quite predictable, but there's also the way in which Trump is using tariff policy, and no one quite knows what the motivation is. How far is it industrial policy and reshoring manufacturing jobs? How far is it just revenue raising? How far is it, designed to achieve other completely different, unconnected policy goals? And the fact that, the tariff threats change from one day to the next, depending on whether Trump needs to distract people or who he decided he didn't like that moment. And I think one of the things that Rachel Reeves' big pitch was during the election was the one thing that she could offer in contrast to the preceding Conservative government was stability. And I think one of the real problems is, even if lots of these tariffs never materialize, the threats of them will be affecting behavior. And it's very difficult. You're deciding to ship something now over to the US, and you saw some of the things about, if your ship hits heavier water and is delayed by a day, it can face a totally different price schedule when it lands to the one that you contracted the initial order on. So I think, it's just hard to sort of make economic policy, and it'll be just a big deterrent to investment. It'll just make you more cautious if you have no idea what world you're trading into and where things lines up. So I think, it's made that task of offering stability bunches harder. I thought one of the things on defence that was really, really interesting in the Chancellor's statement is how much defence spending is now sort of, being integrated, if you like, into the industrial strategy, that, defence is going to be one of the sort of big sectors. And I think it's really interesting because, it's a question on net zero. Does it actually add to the overall productivity of the economy, or is it a compliance cost you have to bear with because you need to make that transition, but actually, is a cost you have to bear, but isn't actually going to boost other sectors or other productivity because you're just switching energy source? And I think it's really interesting how far we see defence as a sort of, positive impact on the economy if we're boosting up the defence sector. And I'd be very interested, I don't know what Jonathan, Ben and Sarah think about, is defence a great driver of growth? I mean, it does offer the sort of high quality manufacturing jobs that makes me sound a bit like Joe Biden, but is it a great thing? We used to always be worried, I think, about when I was doing lending to developing countries for export credits, if they basically were using them to the defence capacity, because we didn't think that particularly added to the productive capacity of their economies long term.
I think we should add to that, though, that the other thing about the defence spending is a small portion, but a portion nonetheless, is being given to sort of SMEs and to tech-related firms. So it's not just the traditional defence industries that are getting this money, and there is some attempt in a way to sort of stimulate technological development as well, which might make it slightly might make that case slightly stronger. I don't know, Jonathan or Ben, do you want to, Sarah? Do you want to come in on this? You don't have to. Okay, well, I mean, this being UK and a changing Europe, we're getting inundated with questions about UK EU as part of this. And I suppose there are two questions there. I mean, one is the degree to which it's possible for Starmer to hug the Americans close while resetting with the European Union. I mean, are there trade-offs there? And secondly, whether in any sense you think the current geopolitical and indeed macroeconomic environments might push Labour to go further in the EU reset in economic terms, I'm not talking about the security relationship, than they might have been willing to promise in the manifesto. Jill, you might as well kick us off there because you're
okay. Let's kick off. I think in terms actually of the sort of reset, it's quite interesting. It depends. if the UK went for a full-blown trade deal with the US that involved accepting US agricultural imports, which any sort of full-blown trade deal with the US would inevitably involve accepting imports with US animal welfare standards, then I think our chances of concluding an SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary agreement with the EU, which is one of the government's 3 demands in its manifesto last year, or 3 suggestions, would be sort of for the birds. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, the government's already alienated farmers quite a long way. They seem to be talking about something to do with tech, which is quite interesting. But I think it's quite interesting the EU's postponed renewing the UK's data adequacy decision until the end of the year. If that's a unilateral decision, not formally part of the reset, make life quite difficult for everybody if we didn't get data adequacy prolonged, maybe to see where we go on that. But I think actually the pressures on AI regulation, tech regulation, more like to come domestically rather than from the EU, where I think there's quite a lot of public concern about the activities if the UK becomes sort of this tech bro hub that Keir Starmer seemed to be suggesting when he was in the States. I do think it's quite interesting if at some point some people in the EU do start to get concerned at the UK trying to duck taking any of the sort of retaliatory measures that either the EU or Canada are taking, and we try and slip through. I mean, there's already been a remarkable lack of solidarity with Canada displayed by the UK. The EU might think we're pretty irrelevant and it doesn't really matter. There's obviously sort of difficult implications via Northern Ireland as well. So I think it doesn't necessarily have to affect them, but it could affect the mood music, but it depends how fundamental the reset is. But I do think that we will see quite a lot of people say we basically need to choose the more reliable partner, and actually rather than trying and ducking and weaving and pick and mixing between the US and the EU, this ought to actually, and is enough, in the same way as Nicola Sturgeon argued that Brexit was enough to cause you to reconsider the once-in-a-generation Scottish referendum and bring that back on. And we've seen this already coming in from the Liberal Democrats. I'm sure some in the Labour Movement for Europe will want to do this too. Doesn't this dramatic change in world circumstances actually give you reasonable cause to say, do we still have to think that a decision that we took in totally different circumstances in 2016 still has to hold? And shouldn't we be thinking about a completely new approach to the EU? And I think that political pressure will pile up on Keir Starmer. But so far, he and Rachel Reeves seem pretty resistant to it. But I think it's really interesting. And the trouble with Donald Trump is that he and his administration, as we now discover from their excellent Signal leaks, seem to so viscerally hate Europe as an entity, and the EU in particular, that any sort of rapprochement with the EU could at some point, maybe particularly after the second state visit has happened, cause Trump to lash back out at us. So I think the trouble with Trump is that any deal is only as good as the moment it's signed. He doesn't seem to particularly feel bound to anything, which is actually a bit of a reverse to the EU, which goes perhaps far too much in the other direction.
Yeah, just to add to what Jill was saying, there's this great store being placed on the possibility of a deal between the US and the UK, but Donald Trump has literally just torn up the Canada and Mexico deal, which he signed and proclaimed as the greatest deal ever. So it's not clear exactly why you would regard doing a deal as something that is either a good thing or something that would necessarily last.
Yeah, Jonathan or Sarah, either of you want to come in on the EU question?
I think that it could go. You can make arguments either way, but I think on the kind of question of EU rapprochement, the EU would need to see something in it for themselves as well. It's not in the bequest of the UK just to decide what that relationship is going to look like and then tell the EU. And I do think that there are some economic areas where the EU might become more interested. For example, if the EU requires really significant amounts of finance for its own defence, the question of kind of capital markets and access to finance and the role of London then becomes back on the table, I think. So I think there are also, in addition to the points that Jill made, sort of kind of issues in the EU that need to be considered in that equation.
Could you imagine circumstances where, for instance, significant tariffs on EU exports to the US mean that EU exporters are looking for other markets and they might start putting pressure on their governments to ease trade with the UK instead? I mean, is any possibility of that happening? Or am I just being hopelessly naive?
Quite an interesting thing with the change of Chancellor in Germany. We know Germany, which basically we're worried about car exports from the UK to the US. But if you're in Germany, you're very, very worried about car exports to the US. And we've seen quite a big fall in German exports to the UK as a result of Brexit, which may be a bit of deintegration of supply chains. I think that's probably the most likely reason. But we know that Merz thinks that Merkel should have done probably a bit more to keep the UK in. And I think that might be quite an interesting change of dynamic within the EU about where do we look for growth. And there was that sort of, I thought slightly odd research done by Frontier Economics a few weeks ago, which did suggest there was a potential mutual benefit, a benefit for the UK and from the EU from liberalising trade a bit more to like a sort of single marketee, customs union-y relationship. Obviously, the export opportunity for the EU is a bit less because we don't impose terribly onerous border controls. It's much easier for them to meet rules of origin criteria than it is vice versa. But I do think there's an interesting possible change of dynamic if you're looking at growth at all costs.
Brilliant. We have now run out of time. Ben, I think, has had to dash off anyway, so let me thank him in his absence. And to the three of you, thank you as always. We will see you around the time of the budget for the next of these panels, if not before. But for the moment, I mean, again, just congratulations on talking about economics in a way that I found intelligible, which is no mean feat. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.